I would like to comment that the ethical algorithm has been developed within Adolfo University through GovLab in the government school with the help from the journalism school, the engineering science faculty, and business school. We salute its authority that are here today, here in person or through our Zoom stream. We would like to remind you that you have the QR code where you can send your question through Menti. We hope we will have enough time to go through all the questions. Our next speaker she comes from the Paris Law School. Raphaële will give us a seminar on how laws, concepts against discrimination, and against people can be approached to have algorithm responsibility. We give you Raphaële Xenidis.
Thank you very much. I am honored and absolutely delighted to be with you today. And I want to say a word of thanks to the organizers, to Alberto Kudu and to Maria Paz, who invited me. And thank you for the kind introduction. So I am, as you heard, one could say a lawyer. And I want to talk about algorithmic bias through specifically the lens of EU anti-discrimination law. And I think this is useful for a reason in terms of comparative or comparisons between different legal frameworks. So I want to take you on a little journey, and this is the steps that we'll cover together. I want to show you some examples that will resonate with Daniel's presentation about concretely how do machines discriminate. So when we talk about algorithmic bias, what kinds of harms do we talk about? Then I want to take you to a look at the law and specifically EU discrimination law. What is discrimination in EU law, right? Sometimes we take it for granted that bias and discrimination are one and the same thing, but the law has a very specific definition of what discrimination is. And then we'll look at the legal remedies against algorithmic discrimination, and I'll tell you a bit what or how anti-discrimination law can be used to redress algorithmic bias. We'll continue the journey looking at other tools. We have anti-discrimination law, but we also have data protection law, the upcoming EU AI Act, as well as a project on liability, the AI Liability Directive. And we'll finish by looking at some of the shortcomings of that legislation, which I don't think it's going to be a big surprise, but are not necessarily linked to technology per se, but rather to a very narrow definition of discrimination in the legal framework. So we might talk about reforms and legislative changes as well. So how do machines discriminate? As I said, we tend to assume that bias and discrimination are one and the same thing, but there's a little bit of work to do here to understand how bias might fit the definition of discrimination, especially in, or for the sake of today's talk, in EU law. Algorithms, as you know, are used in a lot of public as well as private sector applications. It could be credit scoring, it could be facial recognition, it could be HR analytics, but things as trivial and mundane as sports or eating habits. And I want to take you to 3 vignettes, so to say, about how AI broke its promises. So when you hear sometimes, people talk about AI, there is this promise of objectivity, this veneer of neutrality that always comes up in conversations, as we heard this morning. But looking at how these systems operate in reality, you realize that we're far from it. So Robin Pokorny here was a student at the university, and during the COVID lockdown, she had to take her exams using a special piece of software on her computer that was meant to check if students were not cheating. So she had to stay, and students in general had to stay in front of their computer so that the software could detect whether someone was passing by behind, whether they were alone in the room, so things like that. And she repeatedly had difficulties connecting to the computer because the software kept saying face not found or room too dark. So the solution for her to be able to take her exams was to project a lamp in front of her face in order for her face to receive enough light to be recognized by the software. And so you can imagine how taking your exam like this is highly disturbing and uncomfortable. So with the help of an organization called the Racism and Technology Center, she went to court and she sued her university. There was an interim judgment that was promising, but she ultimately lost her case because of proof issues, evidence issues. There's a lot of talk about the opportunities of AI in public systems and the welfare system. So we heard an example in Rotterdam this morning. There's another example that has attracted media attention in Austria, and it's the AMS algorithm. So that algorithm is not an AI algorithm. It's a simple model, but that uses the variables that you see on the left of the slide. So for example, gender, age group, citizenship, level of education, health impairment, etc. And as you can imagine, those variables are problematic because they can lead to biases that are actually prohibited under non-discrimination law. So let's take an example. The algorithm would attribute or allocate a risk score that is much, much higher to a woman who is a single parent than to a man who's a single parent. And if you reflect upon that assumption, what does it tell you? Well, that there's a stereotype somewhere in the system that women take care of kids and men are breadwinners. And so even though they are actually in the exact same situation, their gender and family status would amount to a different risk score for them. I'm not going to go too much into that example because it's very similar to what we talked about this morning. But I want to go over another example that was revealed by Lighthouse Reports as well as Le Monde yesterday, in collaboration with La Quadrature du Net, which is a French NGO, about the algorithm that the CAF uses, which is a sort of social security system, family benefits. And they have an algorithm that, once again, attributes a risk score to people to decide whether they become the subject of fraud detection and fraud investigation. And you might not be able to see it fully clearly on the right of the slide, but there are several factors that are used by this algorithm. So, for example, age, marital status, income, disability benefits, etc. And again, gender plays a role here, affects the risk score of women more negatively than it does for men, and income as well. So one of the conclusions of that research was that families in precarious situations, and especially single-parent families, among which women represent 80%, are the most targeted by those controls, which can be really damaging to such families. I've talked about the public system, I've talked about the university, and I want to talk briefly about the private sector. So Facebook and Google use algorithms to optimize the way in which advertisement is being distributed to users. Algorithm Watch, which is an NGO, ran an experiment and they crafted different advertising posts for jobs like, for example, truck driver or nurse or a childminder, things like that. And they went on Google and on Facebook and they asked the platforms to distribute those pieces of advertisement neutrally. So they didn't want to target any specific group. And you see the result of that experiment. There's a very high gender segregation in the distribution of those pieces of advertisement. So truck driver positions went to men, and childcare workers went to women. So that, again, tells you a lot about the stereotypes at stake in those algorithmic systems. But also, this harm is not only symbolic, right? Because if you're exposed to asymmetric information, this also shapes your opportunities in the future. So you're perhaps going to apply for that house that you saw online or that job that you saw online. And so this also perpetuates a segregation, in that case of the labor market, but of an unfair allocation of goods and services more in general. So the harms are symbolic, but they are also tangible. And this is what I want to tell you. These harms have a material reality. About ChatGPT and LLMs, I just conducted a small experiment myself, which is more anecdotal than a serious piece of research. I want to underline that. But I asked the system to tell me a story about a boy and a girl recounting their biggest dream. And you can see that it's, again, full of stereotypes. So Sophia wants to be a famous musician, and she wants to perform in front of people. And Alex wants to go out there, be an astronaut, and explore space. So you have this, if you read Bourdieu, you have a good overview of the kind of stereotypes that that discovers the inward versus outward, the space versus the arts. And so these stereotypes are shape inherently those models. And again, the harms are not only symbolic, but also very tangible. So when we speak about these models, a lot of the times we hear the formula garbage in, garbage out. But what I want to say is that it's important to have in mind that the problem is more complex than that. So yes, of course, if you input biased data into a system, you're going to have garbage out. But at each and every interaction of the human-machine hybrid system, there are potentialities for bias as well. So take the interpretation of an algorithmic output, for example. It's been proven that there is a phenomenon called disparate interactions, which means that the very same recommendation by an algorithm for two different publics, let's say black prisoners and white prisoners, would be different, would work to the advantage of white prisoners and to the disadvantage of black prisoners. So again, bias is infiltrating the very way we as humans interpret algorithmic recommendations. And there's one more point that I want to make, which comes from the research of Deborah Hellman, which is very interesting because she tells us about two kinds of injustices. Injustices that affect the representativeness of data, and injustices that don't. So you have data that is unfair because it's not representative, right? So if you go to a poor community and you collect data through internet, you might end up not having representative data because people don't have access to internet, right? But now, let's say you provide everyone with a smartphone. The data you get will be representative, but will still reflect deep inequalities in society. So think about the gender pay gap, for instance. In the EU, we have 13% of gender pay gap on average. This is in the data, and it's correct. But it still doesn't mean that because the data is representative, this is fair. So we have those two kinds of injustices. One can be corrected by, collecting more data, and the other one just cannot, and needs remedies that are more holistic and societal. So I've talked about bias and the harms that bias creates, and I now want to tell you a bit about discrimination in EU law. We have a very complex legal framework with quasi-constitutional provisions that you see on the left, and provisions that are akin to legislation on the right. What's important to know is that those provisions protect from discrimination on the basis of race or ethnic origin, age, religion or belief, disability, sexual orientation, and sex. But not everywhere, mainly in two domains, employment is the first one, so the workplace. And the second one is goods and services, but this is restricted to race and to sex discrimination. So the framework is patchy, but the good thing is that it provides a minimum framework for EU member states, and they are able to go beyond that and to take their own legal requirements. There are three conditions for algorithmic bias to constitute discrimination in the legal sense of the term. The first condition is that it has to harm one of the groups that you see in the blue circle. So either it creates a disadvantage based on sex, race, sexual orientation, age, disability, religion, or belief, or it's simply not discrimination in the legal sense. You could look at the charter as well, which provides a bigger kind of material scope, personal scope, but I'm not going to go in there just yet. Now, the second condition is that it has to fall within the red circle. And the red circle is about the domains that are protected by the law. And as I said, it's highly unequal. Work is protected in a transversal manner, but not goods and services and not education, which is, for example, only protected with regard to race discrimination. So you have your two first conditions. It has to fall within the personal scope and within the material scope of the law. And the third condition is that it has to correspond to one of the definitions of discrimination in EU law. There are two main definitions. The first one is direct discrimination, and that's differential treatment. I'm going to give you a very concrete example. If the police releases a call for application and says, we only want women or we only want men, this is going to be directly discriminatory because it explicitly references a protected characteristic. Now, if the police says, we actually want to recruit men, but we're not allowed to put it in there, so we'll say, we want to recruit people who are higher or taller than 1.70 meters. So this is neutral, right? It doesn't reference specifically an explicitly protected characteristic. But the effect of that call for application is that obviously it's going to disadvantage many more women than it does for men. So this is indirect discrimination. It's prima facie neutral, but it does disadvantage a protected category disproportionately. This is important because in order to understand what legal regime will be applied to algorithmic discrimination, one has to know whether it's direct or indirect. In the case of direct discrimination, there's almost no excuse, if you will. So there's a very limited number of exceptions. Whereas for indirect discrimination, if there's a prima facie case out there made in court, the defendant could say, oh yes, but I have a good justification for algorithmic bias. And there comes what we call in law an open-ended proportionality test, where the defendant gets a chance to say whether the system is justified and proportionate. So you can imagine that this is a much looser legal regime than the one for direct discrimination. So there's a real legal stake in differentiating between direct and indirect discrimination when we talk about algorithmic bias. So what happens when a case comes to courts? If, for example, Robin Corney, whom I talked about at the beginning, is able to bring a prima facie case of discrimination in court, so she adduces evidence credible evidence that there might have been discrimination, then the burden of proving that discrimination did not happen shifts onto the defendant, so in that case onto the university. And it's the university that has to prove that there hasn't been discrimination. And this is a legal mechanism that we use because discrimination is very difficult to prove. So it's a play around presumptions in order for cases of discrimination to be made more effectively, right? There's a sequel of legal consequences that arise once a case of discrimination has been proven and not rebutted. The European Charter of Fundamental Rights has an Article 47 on effective remedies, and so that means that access to justice has to be ensured effectively and everyone has the right to an effective remedy. And the directives, in addition to that, foresee sanctions, and the sanctions have to be dissuasive, proportionate, and effective. So this guarantees legal remedies for discrimination. Maybe two important things at this point so that you understand how anti-discrimination law can be used to combat algorithmic bias. It's about sanctions and it's about the leveling down. So a lot of the times you will hear people say, okay, if my algorithm isn't fair to everyone, what I'll do is that I'll lower the performance so that it's the same to everyone, right? So the disadvantage increases for the privileged parts of the users or the end users. This in EU law is not allowed. So if you look at the Cresco case, for example, the court said that as long as measures reinstating equal treatment have not been adopted, observance of the principle of equality can be ensured only by granting persons in the disadvantaged category the same advantages as those enjoyed by persons within the favored category. So it's only about leveling up and not leveling down. And I think from a business perspective, this is very important to know. Okay, so I spoke about anti-discrimination law, and I briefly want to tell you about the interaction of anti-discrimination law with other provisions, namely the AI Act and data protection law. So you know the AI Act by now. It adopts a risk-based approach, and it does recognize that biases in algorithmic systems can create discrimination. So if you look at the recitals, it speaks about the risks of violating the right to be discriminated against and perpetuating historical patterns of discrimination, for instance. But when you actually look at the content of the Act, besides the recitals that have no binding value, the story is a little bit different. So bias is dealt with in Article 10, which is about requirements for data. And remember what I told you at the beginning, that, okay, data is an important part of where algorithmic bias comes from, but it's not the only part. There's a lot of biases that run throughout the system, which is really a socio-technical assemblage more than just a technical system. But nonetheless, what the EU AI Act tells us is that there are data governance requirements, for example, to examine possible biases that are likely to affect health and safety of natural persons or lead to discrimination prohibited by union law. So there's a recognition that bias mitigation is part and parcel of the quality of those systems. And we have an interaction here with Article 9 of the GDPR, which is about sensitive categories such as the use of ethnic origin, race, genetic features, health status, for example. The question here is, does data protection law actually allow using those sensitive data to detect and correct algorithmic bias? So usually it's not allowed to use those protected characteristics in data processing, but what the AI Act tells us is that for the purpose of ensuring bias monitoring, it is allowed. So it's not enough to take those protected characteristics out of a system. We very well know that an algorithm will find correlations with protected characteristics to replace those data. But on the contrary, we need to use those data in order to monitor the effects of algorithmic systems onto those protected groups. And the AI Act provides for a way to do that explicitly. And I refer to the paragraph of the GDPR where this is grounded. But nonetheless, despite those useful interactions, there are shortcomings and issues that remain with anti-discrimination law. The first is that the heuristics of discrimination law are unsettled. So usually, in order to prove discrimination, the court will resort to what they call a comparison test. So I have to compare my position, for example, to the position of Daniel here, to tell the court that, but for our gender difference, we would have been treated in the same way. And this comparison is a heuristic model that the court uses in order to detect discrimination. It's very difficult for end users online to compare themselves to others because of the personalization that takes place online. So you see what you get, right? And for that reason, it's extremely difficult to understand how Daniel and I have been treated in a different manner. Another problem is then to bring prima facie evidence. So Robin Pokorny, from my story in the beginning, she had to go around university and ask other Black students whether they were experiencing the same kinds of problems. So you see the work that she had to do in order to be able to adduce prima facie evidence to trigger a shift of the burden of proof in courts. So this is a huge burden on end users and potential victims of discrimination. There's a host of other problems. So in black box algorithms, it's very difficult to prove causality. So it's very difficult to prove direct discrimination, that you have been discriminated against because of a protected characteristic. Because most of the times, unless those characteristics are directly inputted in the system, that machine learning algorithm will probably use correlated variables, like place of residence, for instance. Consumption habits, like what you buy on the online market, things like that. And so it's also very difficult to make that distinction between direct and indirect discrimination, because whether a system is neutral or not is really a normative question. I could talk about the other problems, but I'll leave it out here, just to come to my last slide to tell you that there's a regulatory project ongoing at the moment. And it's the AI Liability Directive, which works around mechanisms of presumptions to establish two things. First of all, a disclosure of evidence. So access to evidence in the context of information asymmetries will be made more effective, but the problem is that again, you kind of have to adduce some evidence that discrimination has taken place. The project mentions that there should be no blanket requests. So that threatens the effectiveness of this piece of regulation. And the second point is a presumption of non-compliance. So when the requirements of the EU AI Act have not been respected, a presumption of non-compliance can arise. There's a presumption that there's a causal link between the harm and the lack of respect for those requirements. So that is meant to help claimants, also in case of discrimination in courts, but the effectiveness of that might be limited. And I want to thank you very much for your attention, and apologize for talking in English instead of in Spanish. Thank you.
Have some time for questions. Romina Garrido is here, Assistant Director of GovLab. That's our mentor there. Ask your questions. Go ahead, Romina. Can you hear me? Okay.
Muchas gracias, Rafael, por tu impecable exposición. Me gustó mucho en particular. I'm going to speak Spanish for the question. So, ¿sí?
Español para las preguntas.
Ahí está. Vamos a... Bueno,
Anybody in the audience, or the Zoom audience, wants to ask a question, you can do it through the Menti. It's projected, the QR code. Have actions here. You spoke about how to move forward with the algorithmic discrimination using a general legislation. Here in the problem, we have been worked on guides and have made some progress that were presented in the previous panel. Change is that we can do this without legislative changes, because we know it takes a long time and those are difficult. And we have tried to move forward with some administrative tools. However, if we want to solve problems like algorithmic discrimination, that there should be a specific legislation in order to address this? Why yes and why not? And supplementing this with a local example, we have an anti-discrimination law that has proven to limited protection that requires changes. Question is, do you believe language of a future amendment, should algorithms be included?
Thank you very much for the question. Sorry once again for replying in English. So I think you raise a very important question, which I've been thinking about. And so, some of my colleagues advocate for a specific change, and I think this wouldn't be wrong necessarily. But as you said, it's a cumbersome process, and it doesn't look like the anti-discrimination regime in the EU would be changed. In the coming month or even years. And so in the absence of that, which again I think would be a good idea, and not only for technology, I think once again the anti-discrimination law is patchy, and it would require change to address problems outside of the technology. Anyway, when I say outside of the technology, again it's a simplification, right? Because the technology and society work together. So in order to address that, the root causes of discrimination have to be addressed anyway. And it's going to take more than just the law itself. It's going to take positive action measures. It's going to take special programs to diversify communities in those sectors, digital literacy programs so that citizens are empowered to challenge those decisions, to understand them, civil society funding to accompany those efforts. But so beyond changing discrimination law, what I have proposed in an article that I'm publishing at the moment is that we use this idea of discrimination as negligence in order to address algorithmic discrimination. If you think about it, algorithmic bias is so foreseeable. The effect of that can be foreseen so straightforwardly that you could argue that failing to prevent algorithmic bias from creating discrimination is already a form of negligence per se. And I'm drawing on theories of discrimination as tort, as negligence, in order to make that point. There's one specific form of discrimination which is called an instruction to discriminate in EU law, which has never been used and which would be perfect to do that. So you could use that, that provision to say, well, a profit maker on the market or a public service that is using an algorithmic system hasn't performed a risk assessment, lets it go on the market like the CAF did, is then liable for failing to prevent algorithmic discrimination. So if you will, you reverse the way anti-discrimination law works.
Question from the audience: how is this discussed being addressed in the European Parliament, and how is the team formed? Is it only composed by attorneys that focus on algorithms, or do you know how the teams that discuss the proposal are composed?
Yeah, I think that's a very important question. So there's been a lot of lobbying going on around the regulations. And we've heard the news about the regulation of LLMs in particular, but I think what's dangerous here is that if technologists and, once again, profit makers, like the ones who sold the system to the Rotterdam municipality, manage to use technological capabilities to frame what is possible and what is impossible when fighting discrimination. I think this might be dangerous because it then constrains our regulation to what technologists say is possible or is impossible. And hence the importance to have an alliance of maybe civil society organizations, investigative journalists, academics, business organizations, regulators, working on this issue. And I think for that purpose, the Algorithmos Éticos project is a very good example of what can be done.
In Chile, where transcendental changes are coming with the new data protection law, which contemplates two rights that are already in the European legislation: proactive transparency in the algorithm use and the right to oppose automated decisions. Our legislation is greatly inspired on the European regulations and decide what can work well here and what cannot, and what can be improved here. So how do you think that data protection or regulations influence bias prevention? Are they enough, or should we think about other things like intellectual property?
So once again, I think this is a very complex question in the sense that transparency requirements are important, but they're not enough because the public, people who don't have the digital literacy won't be able to action those pieces of information, even to make a prima facie case of discrimination in court. So I would argue and advocate for intelligibility requirements rather than just transparency requirements. The second thing is we as individuals are not empowered to go to courts and do access to justice, so we need support. Discrimination law has been very individualistic. This has been a point of criticism for the past decades. And I think there is more space that should be made, especially in the EU AI Act, for collective action. And this requires the help of supervision agencies, public institutions like equality bodies, for instance, but also civil society organizations that need to monitor what's happening out there. They are in a much better position. They have the funds, they have the resources, when they are funded. To actually do that and to help people go to courts and gain access to justice on that basis. As individuals, it's much more difficult. It takes resources, it takes time, it takes literacy that perhaps victims of algorithmic discrimination don't have. So I definitely see scope for more collective action there.
Muchas gracias, Rafael, y creo que se nos acabó el tiempo.
I just want a round of applause for our speaker. Thank you very much.
Thank you both, and we ask you to take your seats. Tomorrow, Rafael and Daniel will be in an academic seminar in the other campus discussing democracy and algorithms. You can ask them more questions then. Take this time to defend the seat as algorithm discrimination in the welfare state in online work platform fund, and we salute its main researcher, Alberto Godoy. So now we call pilots in real case for ethical algorithm developed in these 3 years. So we invite our panelists, Maria Isabel Romero, Head of Department for Modernization in the National Health Fund, Patricia Coronado, National Director of Social Security Institute, David Ibáñez, General Director of the Council for Transparency in Milan Di Giadra, founder and CEO from NEX, and President from the Company Association for Ethical Algorithm. Panel will be held by Romina Garriga, Assistant Director of the GovLab and Pilot Coordinator for the Ethical Algorithm Project. I also remind you that the complete seminar will be published in the UAE website, where you can see the complete video in YouTube as
¿Tampoco? Ahí sí. Ya, ahí sí. Bienvenidos a todos. Muchas gracias por
welcome. Thank you for being here in this panel. David Ibáñez is coming up the stairs, So he will sit down quietly as soon as he arrives.
Vamos para aprovechar al máximo el tiempo que
To
tenemos,
use
vamos a seguir en el formato pitch.
make the better use of our time, you will have
Para
5 minutes to make your pitch and tell us about your pilot, and then we will move on to the conversation. I'm going to stop my stopwatch. We will start with Marisa del Romero, who is the head of modernization department for the National Health Fund, and she's doing a program on support programs for audits. Okay, good afternoon. As Romina said, I come from the National Health Fund, and there we have experience in IA models. We have in the sense of medical leaves, as well in the urgency care law, where we have to do audits. And this is born from the need of focalize selection of providers who we have to audit. Our guideline says that we have 2 ways of by services, by institution, that's by the primary health care, and through urgency, and free choice medical care, where you buy your ticket and then you can go to private health care. The law tells us that we have to care that the resources that we have are used in a proper way. So that leads us for our controller division, those audits in the free choice scope. You will remember we've been on the press detecting fraud by medics, by doctors, that being scamming the government. So we reviewed the tools that we had, and we realized that what we had, well, too many warnings. It wasn't feasible for our auditors to do so many cases. So we had this project where we review what we had before with the support of UAI, and we call out for a bid. Have 15 bidders. For us, it was very successful bid, and then we end up with a proposal made by the winning company, and that proposal is based in first selecting the sample, then selecting the services that they were given. About have as law providers about 17,000 non-legal entities are millions, so this is a huge universe. So we did cross-reference by cases done by auditors, and with that we selected what were the providers and what services we should focus for the audits. And with that, we tested many models, the Atom 3, as you can see, random forest as well, and gradient boosting machine. And from those models, we have over 70% sensibility. And with those models, for both for companies and natural persons. So we ran these models. Thus, we detected that there were biases. So what AI allowed us was to detect how we can be influencing the choices of providers and services. I'm sorry, I need some water. As I was saying, we ran with the Akitas model and we noticed these biases. So when we do these models, we found out that in some way we are focusing audits in foreign people. We noticed there was bias by gender and age. So what we're doing are reviewing these biases to end up with what bias we have to accept, because we, you notice, if we have more women that are using the service, that is what happens, then there will be more women selected by the company. That was I will be able to tell you right now. 5 minutes on the dot for Maria Isabel. 5 minutes on the dot for Maria Isabel. So now you have Patricio Coronado, is the National Director of the Social Security Institute, and he used the non-collection model. Thank you, everyone, for those that are still here. It was a very short but intense day in regards to knowledge. I would like to thank you for the possibility of being here with such distinguished guests and allow us to continue to grow. So what is our problem? The IPS is a social security institution that pays practically all the social benefits and pensions benefits that the state provides. Thus, when we define the problem with an initiative as the beginning of IPS, we are not doing the same as we did before, because the citizens are not the same and the citizens are not asking for the same. And one thing that happened before, part of our culture, if somebody does not go and collect their benefits, then it doesn't care, he's lost. And that's the reason why the state can continue with its work without any problem. But after a social upheaval, pandemic, and all the social benefits became very relevant for everybody. So now our IPS, we issue more than 2 million benefits, and less than 1% are non-collected. That is very little, a very small number, but that is a very significant number if we consider that a lot of people, their only income will be this benefit. So what we should care for us as an institute, not the people that doesn't collect, but why the people are not receiving the information and not using this benefit that is assigned by law. And maybe somebody asks for it, but then they don't know that they receive it. So that's why we did a pilot in a predictive model of machine learning with a high probability. I mean, if you already have non-collection of 1% is very low, but for us, that 1% is significant. So what we do with this information? We move forward and we look for these people and to figure out why they were not collecting their benefits. So these variables that are several and descriptive in nature allowed us to wider our attention network and wider our ways, not only sending letters and the people will not open it, maybe not receive it, but what is important here is to understand why those people in particular are not doing what they need to do, and what is the condition or the situation that changed over time since the moment they request for the benefit. We were not only able to find out other solutions, but we figure out a way to increase our capacities as an institution, not only to pay out, but also to incorporate other tools. So what is this about? The results for other institutions, these are normal numbers. But with this model and developing these tools, with the help from the Adolfo Ibáñez University, we've reached 600,000, 92,000 payments, more than 32,000 million pesos paid, and 300,000 people that have been benefited. And this model allowed us not to only reach these people, but to move forward and to retrain the model and also find another ways to deliver these benefits. Thank you.
David Ibáñez, he will present the pilot for the general algorithmic transparency. Can you hear me? Hello? Well, first of all, I am so sorry that I could not be part of the panel from the beginning, but Bob me. Well, so for us, this has been an experience, unforeseen results that are positive. It's been good. And that has been really interesting. Remember when a couple of years ago, when we talked about this, executed in order to determine how we could incorporate transparency, actual modernization systems, not this digitalization of the state, not that. Actual, real modernization of the state that has to do with the fulfillment of public duties using technology. That's basically what it is. Modernization. So modernizing it means citizens. That's a core issue, backbone of the public function. I just wanted to say that I think it's relevant. We developed a piloting process because we are focused on reaching a general instruction on algorithmic transparency. Context, I can say that the Council for Transparency has three fundamental duties: side of transparency regulations, promote this right to access for fulfillment. And in this vein, it is necessary to determine and build normative actions, which are defined by our general instruction, questioned by some state bodies, should be subject to processes. And the interesting thing is that in logic of this construction, not wanted to make it strictly experimental. We rather wanted to develop, along with evaluate how the model was in terms of some institutions that were using these automated decision or semi-automated decision systems. And I think that's extraordinary. People. Particularly people that did not have the information or did not obtain the benefits that the state has allocated for them. So this pilot was joined with the superintendents of re-entrepreneurship and also the health superintendents and other organisms. That is where we found these automated or semi-automated decision systems. I think it's also good that it's all still semi-automated, where the machine making mistakes, maybe due to the rules or the definitions. Here, individual is still irreplaceable. Internally, the Council for Transparency is also developing some pilots in order to reach automated decision mechanisms. I can say that as a consequence of the right to access, we have more than 13,000 legal remedies, and sometimes they are revoked fast. But it is important for people to know that these are not our competencies, they're others. So, there are aspects that have to do with training, instruments in order to learn how these tools are used. We also require to move forward in terms of awareness about the importance of these mechanisms. People need to know why they are getting a benefit. Clear rules, things as simple as how to fill out forms, practical recommendations on how they need to act. So in conclusion, we think this has been a very positive experience and we need to continue to deepen this. And I'm very happy that state administration agencies believe in these sorts of initiatives. Thank you very much. Everyone, here we are also with Milan Gidara, Association of Ethical Algorithm Companies. And now we will have a conversation panel. Questions. Ethical Algorithm Projects has tried to put into practice data ethics, responsible AI, when developing private company. How do private companies have addressed these ethical challenges when implementing algorithms in your case? Thank you for inviting me. Give you some context at NEX. What we are doing is that we are AI. Natural language models in order to understand what a patient who has a need telling us in order to find a solution. Algorithms that predict the patient's behavior in order to optimize health centers are doing. And we started about 7 years ago. We serve many, many patients. And everything that we spoke about today, we experienced it in our skin. Examples. Cannot talk of AI if we don't speak about artificial stupidity. Many of you have tried ChatGPT, and in many cases, the chat gives you back something that is consistent and well written, but the data is not real, and this is normal. An algorithm based on predictions, based on statistics from data. So sometimes the curve is higher and there are less mistakes, but we cannot. So an AI algorithm cannot have an 80 or 85% certainty or above that. Percentage in a system like ours that communicates directly with the patient can generate a lot of frustration and can lead to errors. For a chronic patient that needs to keep their appointment made 3 months ago, drugs because they need a prescription, it's very serious for them to cancel it by mistake. So that was one of the ethical challenges that we found. And I agree with the colleague here that it's not really wise transitions to automated machines. Not yet. Talk from person to person. Society in the world, we are trying move towards a more inclusive and fair society. We also need to understand that AI going in the opposite direction. So it is pushing for everyone to follow the same example and fit in the same box. Challenge that we found, data bias. Since we started here in Chile, we started in the upper sector of Santiago. We know that in Chile, depending on your socioeconomic status, you have more or less ability, reading skills. So when we wanted to expand our service, patients in Maipú, for example, where the data was very bad, people did not understand the questions, they didn't know how to answer, and this led to errors. And that's when we understood the need. This was 6 years ago. Nobody was talking about AI bias or any of this. And we came across this and we understood that with this tool, we were, without meaning to, we were generating I won't even go into what happens when we went to the other countries where people cannot even write audio files over WhatsApp. Third challenge, to what degree do we want our Sorry for talking too much. I would like to ask Patricio and Maria Isabel, where did the interest in implementing a project came? In your at your institutions, incorporating data and AI. Yeah, can you hear me? First of all, as you know, FONASA, the National Health Fund, has almost 18, I think maybe 19 million beneficiaries, which is over 90% of the Chilean population. It's the main health insurance, and that doesn't mean that we have a lot of sensitive data, health data, to use the data that we have, surveillance people who were committing fraud. Every fraud meant less services or benefits for other people. So as we also had other tools, we decided that the best thing was to add another tool. Then we came across a bias, and we decided to take that road. Had an fairness analysis. So how could we be more efficient in supervising this? Because of course, in the public realm, we always are lacking resources. People who can do this job are also scarce. Patricio? Well, like I said, to us it's really important to bring the benefits closer to people, especially considering that the beneficiaries who receive the benefits are vulnerable people, senior citizens, or people who have a gap or far away from the state. So it is important not only to have worked on a predictive model algorithm, but this also allowed us to move forward and balance the data that we had. By having gender variables, for example, or age, different types of information, well, in the design, sometimes there's always something missing. And the good thing of working on this model that we did with you helped us balance the information, but also to look at what we were doing from outside. And when you don't balance the information, there's always bias. And that prevents us from doing our job. And sometimes we can provide some bias that damages the citizens. So obviously what we did here was work on preventing bias and reaching as many citizens as possible, and also help improve the relationship between citizens and public institutions, and above all, to be more effective public policy when it was created, when all these benefits were created. As a legislator, the government always thinks about reaching the citizens, and there's always a gap, because to reach them, we have to be interested in doing our work.
Muchas gracias, Patricio. David? David.
Yes. Spoke about the pilot for the general instruction, which was with 4 public institutions and 7 algorithms that published information. What were the main challenges for these institutions when they implemented these transparency practices with the algorithms? Because it leads us based on from knowledge to known knowledge. There's a paradox here when we think about information access or transparency, where it's all about knowledge, but it turns out that based on our experience during this pilot, we discovered that there was a lack of knowledge within the institutions. Of lack of knowledge on how the systems operated. I'm thinking about this. This should be advertised or made transparent in the future. That was one issue. The second thing, lack of knowledge regarding who in charge at the institutions who have the obligation to publish. Something that not only happens in this pilot, this is something that we permanently observe when we promote or train the obligated subjects. Painful, but more when you have to take charge of this action. So at state organizations, there's still a degree of lack of knowledge on how to move forward. And that's why the government is constantly training and promoting. Also something that we wasn't certain whether these systems should be made transparent, these automated decision systems, and how this could contribute more or less in terms of the right to access or other fundamental rights. And just one more thing, and this is really relevant, think about institutions that have type of mechanism. Others said there's a problem regarding personal data, sensitive data, or data that, when they're mistreated, become a problem. But also in terms of the vulnerability of these data. So there's creates a challenge regarding how we will face knowing and managing this huge amount of data in a context related semi-automated systems, which is something that is already here, and they will continue to grow.
Thank you, David. I want to go back to Patricia and Isabel because doing this pilot was very challenging, but very interesting because find the internal developers, in case of IPS, has a large, amazing data science team, and in the case of FONASA, they have a very recognized supplier in the Chilean IT world. And both, they start with a project that already sets, and they already have pre-done designs. So was it needed to adjust the original design when we incorporated ethical algorithm data? Was this different from the original planning? And the audience has a question for you. How do you qualify the quality of the algorithm for this model, for the non-collection model? So, can you hear me? Well, first of all, I would like to tell you that we are not done. We are not be able to do adjustment yet. However, we are we are thinking that once we complete this stage, the development stage, we'll be able to do the first training. We're doing the first training. We will do any needed adjustment if there are not problems by the algorithm or bias problems. For us, the fact that we put a goal for us that our detection systems have to go through ethical algorithm lead us for us when we do training and when we decide. Firstly, we will have to be very clear. We cannot have tools that have bias because that will mean treatment. So in a summary, we're not done any adjustment to report yet. Well, first of all, indeed, we did this with the support of this university, but we did it with our internal teams and with, as you mentioned, part of the learning process. Is that we didn't alter our goal. The original meaning of what we were doing has not been modified, but what we did modify was the treatment of information, usage of or development of the tool itself, and in a way to review often the data that we consider for the initial upload. And as long as we were looking to how to develop the tool, we also have to improve and in a way look to how to get to know our objective, our client better. So the people that don't collect their benefits and because we may not understand that and those are women, because the women are for the most part who are more interested in social benefits, or the one that take care of that in the home. So what was our challenge? It was to balance the information. That is the most difficult part, because when we do it internally we may do a bang-up job, but there's always opportunity improvements. And inner work allowed us not only retrain the model, but to avoid impacting minorities, because they're always the one that feel the impact the most that comes from bias.
Patricio. Milan,
So, Milan, we
hemos hablado
talked
durante este panel de las
about the new
nuevas
way in
formas en
which the
que el
government,
Estado a
through
través de
this
estos
pilot,
pilotos está
is developing
desarrollando,
and designing
diseñando
and
y
also
vendiendo también
procuring
soluciones de ciencia de
data
datos.
science
¿Crees que
solution.
las
Do you
empresas
think
están
companies
preparadas para afrontar
are
los
ready to
desafíos de estas
to
nuevas
face
formas?
challenges in a similar way?
Yo creo que
No,
no.
not really.
¿Y qué
What
consejo
would
darías
your advice be?
para poder partir de buena forma?
Es muy
Difficult
difícil. Es muy difícil
from
desde una mirada
from
de
a
una
private
empresa
company
privada
perspective to
aceptar
accept
lo que
what is
se
coming.
viene.
And I'm going to
Te
tell
voy a
you
decir
why.
por qué.
The
El
world we're
mundo que
living in
vivimos hoy día
is very
muy
challenging
desafiante. Es muy desafiante
because
porque todos los
every
negocios
business
están cada día más
are
en el
more in
océano
the red
rojo.
ocean.
Lo que nos gusta decir,
We
tenemos
have
cada día
every day
más
we have more and more
competencia, cualquier cosa que creemos que es
challenges and
innovativa,
rivals.
aparecen competidores
When you
en un par
create
de
new
semanas.
technology, in a couple of weeks, you have new
Que
rivals.
una
And the
única
only
cosa
one
que
thing that
está viéndose como algo que puede
you're
convertirse en
seeing
un
that can
negocio
turn a business
para poder trabajar en
to
un
go into
océano
the
azul
blue
es inteligencia
ocean is
artificial. Y si nosotros
AI.
tenemos
And
hoy día
if we
un
do
Sam
Alt
Altman
Admont
que partió
that
como
started
una
as an
fundación sin fines de lucro
NGO
con intención
with the
de
intent of
establecer normas
setting
éticas de cómo se va a
ethical rules
utilizar
for the usage
inteligencia,
of
y hoy
artificial
eso
intelligence,
crearlo
and now is
una
the first one
carrera,
to
venderla
sell
a todo
this
el
to
mundo y anda
everybody, and it's
haciendo
lobbying
lobby
country
de
from
país a
one country to
país
the
de
next
cómo se van a hacer
on how to
legislaciones
do
para que él pueda
laws
ser
for
primero que va a
that
entrar
will allow them to
para
be the
vender.
first
O
one to
sea,
be able to sell.
es muy
So
difícil.
this shows you how difficult this
Yo
is.
recomendaría
I
a las
recommend the
empresas que trabajan
companies
en Chile
to
salir a vender fuera,
sell
especialmente a
outside,
Europa,
especially in Europe,
porque ahí ni siquiera
because
hoy en día
today
es muy
it's very
difícil
difficult
partir
to start
un
with a pilot
piloto
without
sin
proving
demostrar qué hace
what
tu
your
algoritmo.
algorithm does.
Y ahí
And
también,
again,
de nuevo,
we'll
vamos
go
a
to the
desafíos. ¿Cómo
challenges.
tú puedes
How can you prove
demostrar
what
qué
your
hace tu
algorithm
algoritmo
does
si tienes
if you
datos que
have
no son
data that
tuyos?
is
Y en
not
el caso
yours?
nuestro,
We are
nosotros somos
B2B,
B2B, entonces
so
datos son
our
de
data
nuestros
belongs to our
clientes y no
clients. I
podemos
cannot
hacer
do
esta cosa.
usage of
Pero
it.
eso a
So
nosotros
for
como humanos,
us,
como UX, nos ha
this has
ayudado
helped
mucho
us
para
quite a lot
entender
to understand the
necesidad
need
de
of
encajar
fitting
circular
in and
bajo
play
algunas reglas
according to some
y
rules,
con eso poder
and with that
seguir
being able
sustituyendo
to survive in the
algoritmos.
long term. Thank you, Milan.
Milan,
David, you briefly mentioned
recientemente el piloto con
pilot
algoritmos
with public
públicos
algorithm
tuvimos con ustedes durante
in the
el
ethical
programa
algorithm
Sandbox.
project. Could you
¿Podría
tell us a
contarnos
little bit
un
about
poquito cuáles han considerado ustedes
consider
como
the
los elementos
key
clave de ese
component
futuro
for a
transparente
transparent
y
algorithm
creíble?
that is going to be part of the government?
A ver,
This is a
esta es
question
una
that is very
pregunta bien
interesting
interesante y
and is also a
quisiera
complex
responder
one
por el privilegio de
and
libertad.
thus derivative, but I'm
Voy
going
a
to
esbozar algunas
give
ideas
you some
generales
general
sobre el
ideas.
punto. Lo
This is
importante,
the
esta
best
es la
line.
idea
This is
base.
important
Eso es
and
lo
the
primero.
first thing. This is the
Este es
start.
un inicio.
And
Y por lo tanto
so
tiene que ser una cuestión
this
de
must
carácter
be
más bien general.
in a general way.
Eso es lo primero.
Secondly,
Lo segundo, que es muy importante,
it's the
es el
language.
lenguaje. Una
Using
utilización de
clear
lenguaje
language
claro para
so
que todos aquellos que vayan
everybody
a
that goes to
explorar,
explore, review,
visualizar
or to
o
use
utilizar este
this
tipo
type of
de
tool
herramientas entiendan de qué
understand
es lo que está
what the tool is
hablando.
saying and
¿No?
what
Es
it's
una
talking
cuestión
about.
central.
That is key.
Y además
And
hay una
also, there's an
idea en el
idea
Estado y
in the
particularmente
government. I'm a lawyer,
yo soy
so
abogado, entonces tiendo a
I tend to
querer hablar de una
speak
manera
differently
precisa.
in a more
Pero claro,
obtuse way,
para que
so
nadie
nobody can
malentienda que
understand that
queramos seguir
and we can prevail.
esclareciendo. Pero
But
lo importante es
what
que
is
las
important is
personas
people
tienen
need
que
to
entender las
understand
cosas.
what is
¿Ah?
going
Y
on.
entonces ahí
So a general instruction must meet these requirements in general terms. So, and in these general terms, I have to say that first you have to have ideas about how the tools are being used, the idea that they are there, the idea that there's an operational mechanism, clear guidelines, business rules that should be known to everybody, so the people have some certainty on how definitions or decisions are made. And these also have a positive effect on what we want as an institution. So this causes a greater access to information that is different, not from the past century, because our government is built on last century laws, and now we have a more collaborative way of thinking. And the most important thing for the citizens is that allows, as long as the instrument is clear, it allows for the people to exercise, do social control, and then from the government point of view, they can actually tell the people what they're using the resources on how. And that general instructions is geared towards this definition, doing a baseline and setting an experience, because this will continue to expand. And I think the experience in our institution, where we are used the guidelines provided by the law, has allowed us to move from a baseline in order, and then to deepen in what we need to tell the people and make everything more transparent. To close this panel, I will give you each 30 seconds to tell us the main lesson learned during your life in the ethical algorithm. 2 years now. Milan's been from the start. So 30 seconds. We go from left to right. Well, I think the main lesson learned, or main insight, and that is something that touches all of us, citizens are changing and public services must change as well. So the biggest challenge is to change with knowledge, incorporating new technologies, and above, with data knowledge. All the institutions have a lot of information, and we have to see how we use it and how we look for help to improve our install capacity in our equipment. When I would like to thank the opportunity that Adolfo Ibáñez University gives us, because that allows us that we are positioning ourselves at the same levels, that the discussion levels that they're in Europe, in North America, and myself as a Chilean woman, I feel very thankful for this and very happy of being able to discuss this in Chile. On the other hand, I can tell you that we are working with IA issues for a long time now. However, we haven't given the importance to ethical algorithm, but what we've taken from this project. We have to review if there's biases and if there's any way that we risk discriminating the population. And as everybody has said, our end user are the beneficiaries. So every money that we can save ethically will allow us to give very service. So that's our main goal. Self, as what I got as insight that I got from this project, is very important with the technology that we're using, not only look for speed, but also to know when to stop a little bit, when you need to take a pause, and to see where you are going, and to are the consequences that may arise from what you're doing. Thank you, Milan. I'm going to going off trade of the trail of what my colleague said,
mi colega, porque
because
en rigor
we are
estamos
coming
saliendo
off the
del
same
puerto de
port.
Pato. ¿Ah? ¿Ah?
1492,
1492 y
we are leaving
queremos
for a new
descubrir.
world we want to
¿Ah?
discover. We
Sabemos que
know we're
vamos
going
a
to
llegar a un
reach a
objetivo.
goal, an objective,
Por lo tanto,
from the
desde la
perspective
perspectiva de la
of the
cuestión
the
central,
core issue. We are on the
estamos en el
unknown territory,
desconocimiento y
and we
queremos
want to
llegar
reach
a
a
algún
degree of
grado de
knowledge. But the
conocimiento, pero las sorpresas que pueden existir
surprises
en ese
along the way
camino
can
pueden
be
ser
very
muy diversas.
diverse.
Queremos
We
llegar
want
a
to
un
reach a
objetivo
goal, but
y
we may end
probablemente
up in
lleguemos
another
muy
one,
lejos.
and that will
Y eso
happen
va a
as a
ocurrir como
consequence
consecuencia de
that
que las tecnologías de
IT
la información, que se
technologies,
llamaba
well,
por allá en
we
los
call
años
it that
90,
in the 90s,
bueno, invaden todos los
permeate all
espacios de
the
nuestro quehacer
spaces on our
diario.
day-to-day lives.
Y
And
esto
as
en
a
el ámbito del
government,
Estado se
this is being
está
defined in a
definiendo de una
critical
manera
manner,
muy
in a very
crítica,
positive
en un
way.
sentido muy positivo.
So for
Por lo
us
tanto,
as
para
a public
nosotros como institución
institution,
pública,
first of
esto
all, this is a
primero que todo
challenge.
significa un desafío,
This also means
también
to
significa
project
una proyección y
and
sin lugar a
also a
dudas también un
commitment.
compromiso.
I go back to the
Vuelvo a los
origins,
orígenes de mis
commitment
palabras,
with the
compromiso con
citizens.
la ciudadanía.
And for
Y por lo
us,
tanto, para
it's a
nosotros
space
es un espacio
where
en
we
el
need
que
to
debemos seguir
continue
también
to collaborate with
colaborando
other
con instituciones
institutions,
del Estado, porque de esa
because in
manera
that way we
vamos a
can
poder seguir
perfect our tools
perfeccionando estas
and
herramientas y
getting
teniendo esta
best
necesidad
result
de
and
entregarle un servicio adecuado a
provide
cada una de las
the
chilenas y
services
chilenos.
that the Chilean needs
Muchas
and a
gracias,
proper
David,
service.
muchas gracias,
So
Emilia,
thank
Marisa
all
y
the panelists,
Patricio,
Maria
por
Isabel,
su
Patricio,
participación.
David and Milan.
Sin
To
duda,
take this
llevar a
into
la
practice
práctica esto ha sido
has
una
been an
experiencia mucho
enriching
más enriquecedora también
part
desde
of
nuestra
my
trinchera
professional life.
profesional y ya
I
que
have the
tenemos
space to
espacios
let you
abiertos
know
acá
this,
y de,
to be able to
de
do
poder hacer las
things
cosas
really, because
realmente, porque
bring
llevar la
ethical
ética
to
a
actual
herramientas
tools, to
concretas, a personas
concrete people
concretas,
like
como nos
Francisco
comenta
tell us
Francisco,
when he
cuando
tells
nos
us
cuenta
how
cómo
these
llegan
benefits go
estos beneficios
to
a
people
las
that didn't were
personas.
not connected.
Nosotros
We
nos damos
realize
cuenta
as
como universidad
university
y
and
como
GovLab
gobierno que
that
esto
this
es
is
posible.
possible. So I ask for a round
Así
of
que les pedimos un
applause
aplauso
for
para
the panel.
ustedes,
You're
para
our
estos protagonistas
protagonists,
de este seminario.
and we move along with our program.
Continuamos con la clase.
Thanks, Romina.
Gracias, Romina.
Please
Les vamos a pedir al
come
panel
here
que
for
se
a
ubiquen
quick
aquí para
picture.
una breve fotografía,
We don't want to lose
porque no
you
queremos perderlos en este gran
while
momento
we set up our
mientras presentamos la
next
siguiente
talk,
exposición. Y yo creo que es un momento
an
importante
important
porque vamos a ver
part,
las
because
principales
we will go into the
conclusiones
main
del proyecto en
conclusions
su
of
primera
this
etapa, pero
stage
también
and to
cómo
see
viene
what
una
is the
segunda
next
etapa del
stage for
proyecto
the
Algoritmos
ethical
Éticos.
algorithm
Así que vamos a
project.
hacer esta fotografía
So we move to the picture and
y
we
vamos
continue
a pasar a la breve
with a
presentación de la directora del
brief
GovLab,
presentation by the GovLab President, Maria Paz Hermosilla.
Bueno, muchas gracias a todos los que persisten. Sabemos que en esta época de atención corta,
This short attention span to give a full morning to one topic is a challenge. I bring a 15-minute presentation, so Carlos, time me out. I don't have more than 15 slides, so I would like to tell you what are the conclusions of these Chilean roads towards a responsible AI. I'm going to elaborate on 5 of them. As I mentioned, I'm the director of the GovLab and director of this project that fortunately has a phase that we are not done. These are great news for us. The first lesson, this is a road that takes time. We came up with this idea. It's been 4 years, and 3 of those we achieved all the tools that we have, and we're still putting the procurement guidelines. We don't have the transparent. We're going to put 2 online courses for this ethical algorithm. So since we signed the agreement, pilots, when we started bidding, the biddings went void. It's been a slow road, sorry. Milestone, we started to see 2.5 years after we started to have products that have lessons that we could share with other users. we did a lot along the way. So this is the first thing. This is not a fast and easy thing to do, to have responsible AI. We have to put a lot of people together in agreement to achieve it. That is something important. Then it requires a lot of preaching, a lot of spreading. Always we need to be communicating, and we will have to convince, as it was mentioned in the morning, we'll still in national policy, the panel of experts, they were experts that said that algorithms were neutral and the data were objective, and we had to have the discussion 4 years ago. Luckily, we convinced them, and I was not the only one there, but fighting the good fight. But this is a long road. There's a lot of preaching to do, and there's a lot of example, and we think that our European, yes, because even though they are very far ahead, there's still a long way to go. So a lot of spreading, a lot of preaching, and we've gathered a lot of international recognition, because what we are doing as a government is a pioneer. We believe this is a lesson, move along policies, but for us, it was important for us because the data protection law still has not been issued and certified, and the change theory was we can advance along the way with other mechanisms. So we invite to build on already existing government laws, because we are pushing for the data protection law. But let's think about Chile country. It has more than 20 base types. In technology, this is the sixth type base. So there are already laws in place. The Council for Transparency has general instruction. I don't know if it's 11 or 12. I had to implement the 11th in the Public Works Ministry. So there's spaces and laws that are already in place. There are government instruments that have different levels of force. All of them are published. So you take this space and then achieve for the same institution to incorporate into what already was there. So we are getting into existing spaces, and that is to move forward while we move along with the new laws. We know that a law does not solve the complete problem.
Everything that we do, the regulations, the guides, everything needs to come from practical, transdisciplinary experience. At first in the world, everybody wanted to write about it, but it wasn't proven with real cases. And this is not simple, it's very complex. And that's why we're very happy to continue for 2 more years, because see that we need to work more on this. So if you look here, we have been testing all of these things throughout the life cycle of the design and implementation of an artificial intelligence. The moment we formulate the project, we make assessments, impact assessments, how we can deliver the data to a third party so they can make an assessment, what it means to measure bias data in the models, what it means to make the models transparent. In the FONASA model, we haven't reached this point yet. Happen when we do algorithmic audits. We did one with the FONASA when we were designing the project. So as you can see, you need to base this on practical experience, and we still don't like any of the evaluations that we did. So Romina is heading this work, and we're trying to create something that we actually like and the users like, so we are all satisfied with the tools, because the tools also have deficiencies right now. With multidisciplinary teams, with experts in machine learning, public policy, sociology, applied ethics, so various disciplines. Not something that only data scientists or only lawyers can do, or only public managers. We have to work together. And that's also a challenge because we also have different language. All of us have different languages. I think that lawyers need to use simple language. But fortunately, Orima always makes an effort so we can all understand the legal aspects. But machine learning is another language as well. So it has to be transdisciplinary. Lesson is that the public and private sectors have to collaborate. This project would not have been possible without this collaboration. With a private university, a private accelerator, and many public institutions who decided to collaborate. And it's not only those who work here, but this project also had some participation with relevant actors, because this is niche, but we had all the public at some point in their pilots had citizen participation instances. FONASA published a draft of the terms and asked the public whether they wanted to participate and asked them for feedback. The digital government division had a consultation about the guide. Chile Compra conducted a market research. So we also need a permanent dialogue, not just companies on one side and the state on the other. And finally, the strengthening of capacities or capabilities is essential. When we designed the project in 2020, designed 2 trainings, one for the private sector and one for the public sectors. And they both had 2 versions, and we ended up doing a lot more than that. This is the initial course that had 2 versions. Then we held a course to help implement, and we planned this in year 2 or 3. We had 2 sessions. Now we added the civil service because we need to have more trainings to adopt and implement the tools. So we underestimated the need for training, and this is a big lesson. And in training, it will probably still be insufficient. We did the best we could. So capacities is key. And of course, when the private sector is competing with the public and there's a leak, an escape of talent, those are the lessons, which already started, and the partners are digital government, Chile Compra, and the Council for Transparency. Of the ANID, the National Agency of Research and Development. The idea is to create a technology platform that takes all these scattered tools, English, and that are all different, and incorporates them into a single open code. One, the platform in Spanish, open code with these tools. Algorithm impact, equity measurement, sheet for the model. These are the minimal tools that we promised and need. That's what we promised throughout the life cycle of a project. And something interesting, a qualitative methodology to measure implements algorithms with ethical standards. Want to understand what changes? Does the trust improve? And this will be conducted by 2 university professors, one a sociologist, and an expert in applied ethics. Pilots for the project. And with this, when all these tools will be in the public algorithms repository that currently has only cases in Spanish, tried, proven, tested by public Chilean bodies. We also want to tell you that we have planners for phase 2. And this will be part of the pilots. And we also are talking with Social Security Institute. So we're open to other public services that are interested in testing these tools. Talk to us because we're looking for cases where we can test them. So we have now others, incorporate others. So that's it. Thank you so much for being here and for joining us, and a big applause for the organizing team, the silent.
Ahí se ve una foto de una jornada de todo, bueno, el equipo es un poco más grande que eso, de todos los que estuvieron.
Bit bigger, but this was a planning session that we had last year. I also want to thank everybody who joined online, and we will continue to work for at least a year and a half more. So thank you very much. So, well, Maria Paz already welcomed, but you know, all the images, the presentation, everything that we saw today and of the project are online on the website of the project. So have a great day and a great end of